Welcome back, everyone, to Old Fart Loves Art. I am A.J. Mittendorf, the old fart who loves art. Let me give you an example of how long I have loved art. When I was a child, I'm not exactly sure how old I was, but I was younger than 10. My family used to take us to Asbury Methodist Church on Sunday mornings. It wasn't a bad church that I can recall. It was a little bit boring for me, but and for my older brother as well, who was, I think, 12 at the time, I'm guessing. But one of the highlights of attending that church for me was once a month, the church would put a devotional booklet in the little pockets in each pew, where they kept the hymnals and the pens and the offering bulletins and the guest cards and all that kind of stuff. Once a month, they would put these devotional booklets in those pockets. Those devotionals were called the Upper Room. And every month, I would grab a copy for myself. Mind you, I had no idea what they were for. I didn't know what a devotional was. And so I never read them. But because of the art on the cover of each booklet, I grabbed them so I could look at the art, admire the art, and appreciate the art on the cover of these little booklets every month. And by the time I stopped going to that church, I think I was 12 or so, I had quite a substantial collection of copies of The Upper Room. And only because of the art. I never read a single one. Now, I'll add to that a spiritual lesson, because this is a Bible-based channel. In my heart, I was stealing those. They were there for us to take, and I was perfectly free to take them. And if the minister or pastor or whatever they called him saw me taking one, he would probably think, gee, it's awfully nice of that boy to take one of those home so he can study his Bible. It had nothing to do with that at the time. These days, I still don't use devotionals myself. I do my quiet times on my own. But I didn't know that those devotionals were there free for the taking. I didn't know why they were there. So I was sneaking them, as far as I was concerned, and taking them home only for the art. And I think if I had died at the age of 13, I would have stood before the Lord and be judged for stealing, even though those booklets were there for the taking anyway. In the world, I was doing nothing wrong whatsoever, but in my heart, I was stealing. And it's the heart that God contemplates, as we're told in 2 Samuel, but I don't remember the reference. Man looks on the outward appearance, but God ponders the heart. That's what we're told. So, there's my little biographical story. Get to know me a little bit better that way, I guess. But that just does show you how long I have absolutely loved art. And I know that I loved it even before I started stealing those little devotional booklets. Thank God I got saved, and I will not be judged for those anymore, because Christ took the punishment for me stealing those little devotional booklets. And I am free to enter heaven because of what Christ did for me. I will also confess today that this is a remake of a video. I did this once before for my other channel called Poetry Revival. And I did that about a year ago, at this point actually. I was one of the caretakers of my best friend who was dying of cancer at the time. And he was very eager to see me get that channel started. And I was eager to just get some content on that channel so that he could hear something, so that he could, see that with his assistance and his teaching me how to use all these software programs, I was able to get this channel up and going. And so it was largely because of his instruction and his patience with me that I was able to do it. And so I was eager for his sake, for him to hear my first episode of that channel. But that's a poetry channel, not an art channel, although I will probably talk about some art on there. It's not primarily for that purpose. I don't know if I'll eventually delete it or not, but we'll see. The original was a 3-part episode, And this one is only going to be a two-part, and that's because I'm going to eliminate the middle part of that three-part episode, which was a debunking of the movie The Da Vinci Code. I may do a debunking again, just revisit that topic and release that in this channel as well. And then perhaps I will simply delete that entire three-part episode from Poetry Revival. I don't know yet whether I'll do that or not, but we'll see. So this is going to be a two-part episode. The first part is merely a formal analysis. So very factual information, nothing interpretive for this episode here. We're going to look at Leonardo da Vinci's The Last Supper, and I'm going to explain some very factual things about it, much of which you will probably be able to find anywhere else that talks about the Last Supper. Some of it, however, is entirely my own observations. So this is not interpretation. I will save the interpretation for the next episode. So let's get on with some facts then about Leonardo da Vinci's fresco called The Last Supper. He painted it between 1495 and 1498, so 3 years plus. And Da Vinci himself lived between 1452 and 1519. That was way back when I was a kid. I am, after all, an old fart. This fresco he did, though, with experimental techniques, and that's largely the reason for its poor condition today. He painted on a wall with a combination of oil and tempera paints, and painted on dry plaster rather than on wet plaster, which is the norm and had proven successful. So the tradition says paint on wet wall, let the paint and the plaster of whatever source they used for their walls dry together. Da Vinci's experimental techniques, however, they kept the paint from being able to adhere to the wall. And so the painting itself began to deteriorate very quickly, within a few years after its completion. So let's look at the painting together. The table where the disciples and Christ are seated reaches virtually from one wall to the next, with very little room to spare. And the disciples on either end of the table, that would be Bartholomew and Simon, kind of stuck on the ends there, they almost don't have enough room to be seated. In fact, all of the disciples are seated so closely together that it's almost medieval in its composition, where people are stuffed together in ways that are almost unnatural. So I think I'm going to get into a little bit of interpretation here. This is more speculation than anything else, though, but I think that Da Vinci did that on purpose, because I think what he's trying to tell us is that we are not able, either historically or figuratively, to participate in this meal. This is, both historically and in his story, a dinner that is reserved solely for these 13 people, Christ and his 12 disciples. We cannot find room at the table, and you'll notice that everybody is seated so that they're all facing us, except for Bartholomew and Simon, who are facing toward the center, toward Christ, that is. There's no way for us to find entrance there. There is a fourth wall, presumably, but we don't know exactly where that is in relation to the table. But Da Vinci wouldn't allow us to sit there anyway. He's doing some things that are completely new for this topic of a painting, which has been done hundreds of times before. The Last Supper is an old topic, even by Da Vinci's time. But he's doing some very original things here, and we'll talk about that a little bit in this episode, but mostly in the other episode. Okay, compositionally, Christ is in the center, and we will talk about him more near the end of this episode, and then even more after that in the next episode. Let's go on to the disciples, though. Let's talk about the arrangement of the disciples here. They are grouped in threes. And that's kind of an interesting thing for Da Vinci to do. The Bible groups the disciples in pairs, generally. If you look up where they are listed in the Gospels, they're mostly in pairs. In one case, they're actually listed individually, each separate from the other. But interestingly, Da Vinci puts them all in threes. And it just occurred to me that that might have additional meaning that I hadn't considered before. Well, I'll have to add that to my notes for the next episode. So I submit to you, to raise your curiosity for the next episode, that there are not 13 people in this painting. There are 15 people in this painting. Very interesting. It just occurred to me. Every time I view this painting, I learn something new. Every single time. And it's a wonderful, remarkable painting. I'm hoping that we have a copy of it in heaven. Or maybe we'll have the original in all its full glory in heaven. I don't know. We'll see what God has in mind for that. That's his bailiwick, not mine. Okay. The disciples. To Jesus' immediate right from our perspective, the viewer's perspective, we have doubting Thomas kind of in the back there, right in front of the window on Christ's right, again, from our perspective. So you have Thomas there, doubting Thomas, with his finger pointing up. Then in the middle you have James the Greater. And further yet to our right, you have Philip. On the far right of the canvas, from our perspective again, you have Matthew, who is facing Simon there, that is facing the end of the table. Then you have Thaddeus, the old guy with the beard there, and then Simon, who's bald-headed there. Interesting note, something I learned in doing research for this episode, is that Thaddeus may be a self-portrait of Da Vinci himself. Frankly, I think that the fresco is too old and too damaged to verify these things, but it's not an unreasonable idea. Many artists did include portraits of themselves in their own work. In Raphael's School of Athens, you have Michelangelo pictured there as Heraclitus, and you have Da Vinci as Plato, and over in the far right, you have a self-portrait of Raphael himself as Apelles, who was a painter in Greece in the 4th century BC. Again, in Michelangelo's sculpture of the Pieta, not the famous one in Rome, but a less known one and a damaged one and also an incomplete one in Florence, Michelangelo is depicted there as Nicodemus. And that's also a self-portrait then, because that's Michelangelo's sculpture. And that also brings to mind the movie The Passion of the Christ, done by Mel Gibson. When Christ is nailed to the cross in that movie, those are Mel Gibson's hands that are seen. He plays the Roman officer nailing Christ to the cross. And, so he puts himself in there because it is we who put Jesus on the cross. Everybody before Jesus lived and everybody after Jesus lived were all responsible for those nails put through Christ's hands and feet to nail him to the cross. Every sin that you've ever done can be forgiven because of that sacrifice. Jesus wanted you to go to heaven. He didn't want you to burn in hell through eternity. And so he died to provide salvation for you. You're not automatically saved. You need to accept Christ. You need to accept his invitation. And to do that, you simply say, Jesus, I know that you are offering salvation to me, and I would like to accept that. And I thank you, Lord, for offering it, and I accept your salvation, Lord, by your blood, because you loved me. All right, anyway. So Mel Gibson's hands there demonstrates that he's admitting his own responsibility for putting Christ on that cross, just like you and I did. Back to the disciples. To the immediate left of Christ, again, from our perspective, you have John, the younger looking one there, and Peter, who's leaning into John's ear, and then in front of the two of them, you have Judas. On the far left of the canvas, starting just behind Peter, you have Andrew, and then James the Minor. That's M-I-N-O-R, not M-I-N-E-R. I don't think he did any digging in the dirt in those days. And then on the end of the table there, you have Bartholomew. So all the disciples are identified, and I'm sure that they all have attributes of some sort that helps to identify them. I am simply doing this based on instruction from art critics and art teachers and from textbooks. I don't know all of the things that are put into the painting to identify each character, which is something I should look into before the next episode, because I just haven't bothered it. I do know some of those attributes. An attribute, by the way, is something that is put into a painting that helps identify who that person would be. Because if it's just a portrait, we don't necessarily know who that would be. All right, let's get more specific now. We're going to talk about the outer 6 disciples first, all 6 of them. I'm going to look at them from a bit of a literary perspective here, if you don't mind. I was a literature teacher for years. I do think there's something from literature that applies here. The outer 6 disciples are, of course, present. We've just talked about them. And they were important both to Jesus and for the historical accuracy of the painting. So they were important to Da Vinci as well. But they play a very small role in Da Vinci's version of this event, at least so far as the moment from Scripture that Da Vinci is illustrating for us. They have a small part to play here because Da Vinci is very concerned about a specific moment, and we'll talk about that later. So the outer 6 disciples are what we would call in literature flat characters. And I'm not talking about the way they look in the painting. I am talking about flat as in they have no emotional depth. They're there to fill out the scene, but they have no depth. From the painting itself, we don't know anything about them except that they're there. And we know based on 3 other disciples what's happening at the moment that Da Vinci has depicted for us. So consider a movie that focuses on the King and Queen of England. And we're in a ballroom, so it's a celebration of sorts. The king and queen are there and a whole bunch of other people. The other characters all need to be there because of the accuracy of the scene. You don't have a ball in a ballroom with just the king and queen. You have a ball with a bunch of people. We're just only interested in the king and queen. So we know who the king and queen are. We know their names. We know some things about their histories. We know some things about their motivations and their desires, and we know some things about their psychology, how they think, how they work, how they function. But with all the other people in that ballroom, we don't really know anything about them, and we don't need to. They are flat characters. We don't know their names. We're never introduced to them, so they remain entirely nameless. We never learn anything about them, so their personalities, their histories, their motivations and desires are unknown and unimportant. They are only there to fill out the scene because without them, the view of the ballroom wouldn't be realistic. It's the same thing with the outer disciples of this painting. They are necessary because the Gospels make it clear that they were there, and Da Vinci wants to be biblically accurate, so much as he is able. But they are less integral to the moment that he is interested in depicting for us than are the other 7 characters. So they are relegated to the periphery of the painting, both literally and figuratively. I think that's amazingly brilliant of him. However, it is interesting to note that while these outer 6 disciples are not important for Da Vinci's story, he still uses them really well for this composition. Ironically, since those characters are less important for the story, Da Vinci makes use of them. He makes them integral for the composition, since they must be there. So he uses them to keep our eyes from focusing on them. Let me say that again. The way they are posed, on the right, the way they are gesturing, on the left, the way they are looking, Da Vinci uses those outer 6 disciples to keep us focused on Jesus. Let me show you how he does that. With the disciples on the right, and again, from our perspective, Matthew gestures toward Philip. but he's looking back toward Simon. Okay, so he's got this looking one way but gesturing the other kind of composition. Very interesting way of posing a person. So he's looking at Thaddeus and Simon. But compositionally, Matthew's hands are raised a little higher than Simon's, and Simon's are a little lower than the hand of Thaddeus, the one that we can see. If you go to Philip, his hands are raised a little bit higher yet. Kind of skip over James a little bit and go right into Thomas's one hand that we can see. And you can draw a line from Simon's hands straight through the hand of Thomas and all the way up to the eyes of Christ. What's happening here is that humans tend to look where people gesture. I mean, that's why we point to something when we're talking about something, right? We point to it, and that turns our eyes to whatever it is that the person is pointing wants us to look at. It's the same here. These three outer disciples are gesturing toward Jesus, and that draws our eyes back to Jesus. Not instantaneously necessarily, and not every time. If you want to focus on them, that's not going to work. But initially, and perhaps on a subconscious level, our eyes are drawn back to Jesus simply because of the line that's drawn from Simon's hands to Thomas's hand and all the hands between. That's remarkable. So even though those outer three disciples on our right are there, they are interacting with each other, they're part of the composition, Da Vinci uses them to keep us from focusing on them because they're not integral to the moment that Da Vinci is painting for us. The same thing is true with disciples on our left, except Da Vinci's not using their hands this time. He's using their gaze. Look at Bartholomew. He's gazing very, very intently directly at Jesus. So is James the Minor, although that's a little bit hard to tell because perhaps because of the damage to the painting, I'm not sure. It looks more like he's looking for fleas in what's left of the hair of Andrew. That's kind of what the impression I get. But he is also actually gazing toward Jesus, as is Andrew, but in more of a surprise. He's almost stunned in appearance, and we'll talk about why later. So, in the same way that gestures lead our eyes to something, when a person points or when a person gestures towards something, we look toward where they're gesturing. We also do the same thing when somebody is looking at something. I was watching a video on YouTube not long ago where a bunch of people were standing out in the outside and they just started looking up in the sky. And everybody walking by did the same thing. They all looked up to see what this guy was looking at. We do the same thing here with Bartholomew, James, and Andrew on the far left of the painting. They're looking at Jesus, so our eyes are going to be guided back to Jesus. Da Vinci was genius in that. Amazing thing that he did that. Okay, we're going to go on and we're going to talk about the inner six disciples now. Again, we'll save Jesus for last. Save the best for last. Now, the seven central figures are most important to the moment that's happening. And even there, it's the three disciples on our left immediately from Jesus that are absolutely most integral. But the three to Jesus' right, from our perspective, are also very important. And I find that interesting as well because if you just take Jesus quite literally here and then the six disciples, you have seven, which is the number of perfection. And it is perhaps for that reason that Da Vinci grouped these men in threes. I don't know, but it's a good possibility. So the six disciples on Jesus' right, from our perspective, we have Thomas, James the Minor, and Philip. So let's look at Thomas. He's right in front of the window, and his one finger is raised, as if to ask, is this God's will? Because of the moment that Da Vinci's depicting here, and we'll get to that. Is this what God wants? He might be asking. But it also foreshadows the comment of Christ to him after the resurrection, when Jesus said, "Here I am, Thomas. Look at my hands, put your finger in my side, We don't know that Thomas ever actually did that, but after seeing Jesus for certain, Thomas said, "My Lord and my God." To which Christ responds, "You believe because you have seen. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet believe." And that's you and me, my friend, unless you are a lot older than I am, which I doubt. Now, the two a little further to the right of Thomas, we have James and Philip, and they are so nicely juxtaposed here. James the Major is gesturing outwardly in a gesture of denial. "None of us would oppose you, Jesus," is what he's saying. Or perhaps, "Not me. It ain't going to happen. I'm not going to betray you." We don't know exactly what he's saying, but the gesture suggests a comment of strength and denial and even a bit of anger, perhaps. Certainly he's stunned by it. He's very adamant. He's very determined, very sure of himself in this moment. So he's gesturing outwardly, making himself bigger, whereas Philip seems more inquisitive. "Lord, is it me?" Philip gestures toward himself, making his appearance smaller in contrast with James. He becomes less significant because he takes up less breadth of the painting than James does. His expression, his face, is also one of fear, of sorrow, of contemplation, knowing maybe what he's capable of as a human being. Who knows? We all are capable of great horrors, every single human being. And I think that there's a bit of an admission that, yeah, he's capable of doing that. There's an honesty there. There's an honesty in both of them, but it goes in different directions. Marvelous composition. Marvelous composition. We will talk more about Thomas later in the next episode. But those three are particularly interesting. On Christ's immediate left, from our perspective, you have John, the younger looking one, Peter kind of behind the other character, Judas. Judas is in front. And Judas has an attribute there. He's holding a bag of silver, 30 coins of silver. That is something that helps to identify him. That's his attribute. While Peter is holding a knife behind his back. That also foreshadows a couple of things. It's Peter who says, "Jesus, here, we have a couple of swords," and here he's holding one. But it also foreshadows the moment in the Garden of Gethsemane when Peter cuts off the ear of the high priest's servant. Very interesting. Now, these three are the most integral of the 12 disciples as far as the painting goes, because it is these three who identify the biblical passage that Vinci is depicting for us. What's happening here is that Jesus has just finished saying, "One of you will betray me." The disciples in the room all respond with astonishment and fear, wondering who he's referring to, because he doesn't say who he's referring to. He just says, "One of you will betray me." This is explained in the Gospel of John, though. Peter leans over to John in the Gospel of John and says, "Ask him," meaning Jesus, "ask him who he's referring to." And so that's what's happening in the painting. Peter is saying to John, whispering, who is he talking about? And in the Gospel of John, Jesus answers, and he says, "It is one to whom I give the bread after I dip it." So there's a lot going on in this painting. In fact, more than could be depicted in a single moment. But Da Vinci has reduced it to a single moment for us. But that's the moment that's being depicted in this painting, and it is identified by the three people on Jesus' left from our perspective, on Jesus' right from Jesus' perspective in the painting. It's also important to understand that Da Vinci is offering an explanation of why Judas would accept the bread from Jesus without hesitation after Jesus has just said, "It's the one to whom I hand the bread after I dip it in the oil or dip it in the wine." I can't remember which it is. In this painting, Judas is put there, but he's distracted by Peter's questioning John. So he doesn't hear Jesus' response when Jesus says, "It is the person to whom I hand the bread." That's fascinating, because that's a very important thing for the composition. Judas is really important in this painting here, the way he did it, because Da Vinci is playing with a great number of traditions for this biblical topic. He's doing things new and wonderfully so. So in Da Vinci's mind, Judas is distracted because of Peter, and he's distracted from Jesus' response to John's question. Otherwise, why would Judas accept the bread if he heard Jesus make that response? You see? So that's Da Vinci's explanation, but it's probably not his real explanation. I think it has to do more with the composition of the painting rather than a doctrinal idea on his part. Jesus may have simply whispered very quietly to John, and John may have asked very quietly in a whisper who Jesus was referring to. We don't know that for sure, but that is an assumption I would make. But compositionally, if that were the case, Judas would have to be elsewhere in the painting, and it would mess up the idea of grouping the men in threes, and I think that would pose some problems for Da Vinci's composition. So I think just for the sake of the composition, Da Vinci placed Judas where he did in that group of three, and made him distracted by Peter's question so that he didn't hear Jesus' answer when John asks him. But that also introduces a number of anachronisms. For example, Judas is distracted by Peter so that Peter doesn't hear Jesus' response. But since Peter is just asking John at this point, Jesus hasn't had time to respond. But the assumption is that Judas would not hear Jesus' response. So it's a bit of an anachronism. Those things could not happen at the same time, and yet in a way they do. Now it could be that when John leans over to Jesus, Peter and Judas start to talk or something. I don't know. I don't think Da Vinci really was bothered with that. There are other anachronisms in there. An anachronism is something that is out of place in a time-wise fashion. Judas and Jesus are reaching for their respective loaves before Jesus has had a time to respond to John. So he wouldn't be reaching for the bread yet to give to Judas. So that's an anachronism. And there are probably other minor ones involved with that as well. Those are the big ones right there. But it doesn't really matter. The idea is the composition and all of this happening at once. And keep in mind, this is a kerfuffle that's happening here. So having things that are anachronistic doesn't really disrupt the idea of the painting at all, because of the very moment that Da Vinci is depicting. But we're going to talk more about Judas here. He is seated on the left from our perspective, but he's seated on Christ's right from Christ's perspective. Very interesting. In art, a person, the main person of the painting, is often depicted looking to the left when something negative or evil is going on, so that left is made equivalent of evil. In fact, the word left in Latin and in Italian is sinistra, where we get the word sinister. And Jesus is looking a little to his left because of the moment that he's talking about. And keep in mind, he also knows that he's going to be betrayed. That's what he just talked about. And he knows that he's going to die very shortly. So looking to the left is appropriate. He's contemplating the evil that's pending. And make no mistake, it is evil. God has often, in the Bible, used the intentions of evil men and evil men themselves to accomplish his own purposes. Amazing how powerful a God we serve. Now, it's not always true that the character looking to the left is necessarily looking to evil. It depends on the story behind what's being depicted in the painting or in the sculpture. But if you look at Michelangelo's statue of David, for example, David is looking to his left. He is looking toward Goliath, contemplating the pending battle between him and Goliath, knowing, of course, that God is on his side, but he is looking toward the evil at the moment that's being depicted there. depending on how you interpret his gaze, he may be thinking, this dude's about to die. I don't think he's thinking, gee, I'm scared of this guy. That would be contrary to the story that's being depicted. But he is certainly preparing himself for battle in any event. Battle with Goliath. Again, another Michelangelo sculpture, the statue of Moses. Very famous statue. He's looking to his left. What's happened here is that Moses has just received the 10 Commandments on the mountain, and he's coming down, and he sees that the Hebrews have made for themselves a golden calf that they are worshiping, and they are indulging in sin of all kinds, not just worshiping the calf, but probably sexual sins and gluttony and drunkenness and all types of things of that nature. So he is looking toward that evil going on, not necessarily at it, but toward it, and he's about to rise from his seated position. You can look at his left foot there. You can see that he's just about to rise. He's putting weight on his left foot, and he's about to rise and head toward the Hebrews, knowing that a good number of them are about to die as well. So David and Moses, they're looking to their left, they're looking toward evil. But that's not 100% true. It depends on the story. We have here Michelangelo's sculpture also of Giuliano Medici, also looking to his left. As far as I know, he's just looking to the left because that's the way the model was seated. There may be no reason whatsoever. I don't know the story behind what's being depicted in this sculpture of Giuliano de Medici. But if you know, please leave it in the comments. Perhaps I'll add it in the next episode. But most definitely here, as far as I know, there is no story to explain why this character is looking to his left. And so he's simply looking to his left. If Judas were sitting on Christ's left from his perspective, and Jesus were gazing that way, then we would know that Jesus is looking toward the evil, and that evil might very well have been Judas himself. But the implication with the other 6 disciples there would have been that he's also looking at those other 6 disciples. So 7 disciples, including Judas, would be depicted as evil in that instance. But what Da Vinci is doing here is he's doing his best to make Judas as regular a dude as he can. You notice that in other depictions of the Last Supper, and we'll go through a couple here, the disciples all have halos along with Christ. Judas doesn't, but all the other disciples do. The 11 others do. Judas is also portrayed as sitting on the opposite side of the table from the disciples. That's a tradition, because they're saying, well, he is unholy, the others are holy. And that's why he doesn't have a halo, and that's why he's seated on the far side of the table from the disciples, closer to the viewers, as a matter of fact. But Da Vinci is saying, listen, he was a traitor, absolutely, and he has the silver coins to prove it. But all 7 disciples are sinful. They're all on an equal par. Not one of them deserves a halo. Jesus is the only one who does deserve a halo. And Da Vinci didn't like halos anyway. He was one of the first to drop them from his art. So none of them have halos. But with Judas not having one, along with all the other disciples, he's making them equal. And that's appropriate, because all of them are sinful. They all deserve the same punishment that Judas will eventually get. It's Christ's forgiveness that prevents it, not anything those disciples have done that allows them to not be considered evil. It's Jesus alone. Judas is also seen in other depictions looking out at the viewers, breaking that fourth wall, if you don't mind me doing this. But here in Da Vinci's painting, Judas blends right in, and he's on Jesus's right from Jesus's perspective. So he is no more evil than anybody else, but neither are those he would be sitting with. There's no guilt by association. If he were on Jesus's left from Jesus's perspective, all 7 of those disciples would be suggested to be evil, if that's what Da Vinci were planning on doing by using Jesus's left gaze. But he puts them on Jesus's right, And that makes all of the disciples equal. They're all sinful. They all deserved hell. The only one who really needs to stand out is Jesus. And you'll notice that John leans away from Jesus, and even the three on Jesus' left, from his perspective, right from our perspective, they are also a distance from Jesus. Jesus is alone there. And we'll talk about the meaning of that in the next episode. All right. We're going to talk about Jesus now. So this is the final part of this episode. Not all about Jesus I will discuss in this episode, though. I will save some of talking about Jesus for the next episode. Compositionally, Jesus is perfectly centered in the painting. Here's a line that shows the horizon. There are actually kind of like three horizons in the background. I chose the middle one, just kind of an average between the three. And then directly in the middle of the room, identified by the middle beam on the ceiling, Jesus is perfectly centered in this painting. His focus is turned inward. Again, he knows he's about to be killed. He knows he's about to be betrayed. He knows in advance about both. And this is a dark hour for him. And this is a dark moment for everybody in that room, including Judas. Again, the vanishing point of the painting is directly behind Christ's head. Well, what's the vanishing point? Well, if you use every single line in the painting, starting with the ceiling there, all those beams, they all converge. The lines that they make all converge behind Christ's head. Even the lines between the ceiling and the wall, those lines, if you extend them, they converge behind Christ's head. The lines made from the tapestries on the walls, the 4 tapestries on each wall, the tops of those make lines that converge behind Christ's head. And the edge of the tables as well. You have to, especially where Bartholomew is, you have to kind of guess a little bit. But if the table were just there and there are no disciples, the line of that table would still converge behind Christ's head. And so Christ is identified and glorified here by making him the center of the painting, both in appearance, but also the center of where everything meets. The vanishing point does not have to be in the center of the painting. The vanishing point can be anywhere in the painting, and that changes our perspective each and every time. But here, the vanishing point is centered with Christ. Da Vinci is actually identifying, pointing out Jesus in every way. And as I mentioned before, Christ is isolated. The disciples are in groups of 3, but Christ is isolated from the disciples visually. Not because he's being ostracized in any way, shape, or form, but because he is being glorified. Right above Jesus' head is a circular pediment. Well, it's a pediment. It's an ornament. Usually above doors or above the sides of buildings, and usually they're triangular, but they can come in a great number of variations. This one happens to be round. Now, if you extend that circular pediment, extend the circle of it, using that pediment as a guide, and here I'll show you another picture of Christ close up so you can see the pediment a little bit more clearly. You look at that pediment and extend that circle that it creates, and Christ is centered in that circle. So the pediment also helps to glorify Jesus, puts him in the center of a circle that is started by that pediment. Now, also, one thing I'll just throw in as far as interpretation goes. If you look at this very carefully here, you look at the circle of the pediment. Jesus' head is in the center of that. You look at the vanishing point, including the horizon. Jesus' head is centered on those lines. You get a pun, a visual pun, in English. I don't think it would work the same in Italian or in Latin, but Jesus, if you just see all of those lines together, the circle and those lines, you have a picture of the Son, S-U-N. And Christ is also the Son, S-O-N. And I find that interesting. I also find it interesting that the larger opening in the wall is right behind Jesus, and Jesus is centered in that. So the circle that is initiated by the pediment and the opened window behind him creates for Jesus a halo that the disciples do not have. Jesus is the only one who deserves a halo. And Da Vinci points that out. But he does it suggesting the halo rather than actually painting the halo. He does it with a light area behind him and that pediment and gives him a halo. And I think that's interesting also because the halo comes from the idea that we beheld his glory from the Gospel of John chapter 1. We beheld his glory. The glory is of the only begotten of the Father, full of grace and truth. John 1:14. But I don't think that's literally what John was talking about. I do not think that Jesus would have any physically visible attributes in real life that we would be able to point at. The halo was invented as a symbol, and Da Vinci didn't like it, but he still wanted to give Christ that sense of glory. And so he suggests a halo. I think that's marvelous. One last thing with Jesus here, and then we'll close. Christ's pose from about the upper waist, the lower torso up, including his hands, Da Vinci put him in an equilateral triangle. And again, I really didn't want to get into interpretive things in this episode, but for this I will. Because I looked for other equilateral triangles in the painting and found none. I tried to look in all the disciples all over the place, putting equilateral triangles, overlaying them in the painting. I found straight lines here and there, like John's left arm, his whole left side, including his head. Well, you have a straight line there. You have an equilateral triangle between John and Jesus, as been pointed out in the despicable movie, The Da Vinci Code. I loathe that movie. I loathe the story altogether. We'll talk about that if I do another debunking of the Da Vinci Code for this channel. There are no other triangles in this painting. Another point before I reach a conclusion here about the triangle is that in most paintings in the Renaissance, if there is an equilateral triangle, it's the entire composition that is in a triangle. At least the main figures of the painting are all in composition. Here are a bunch of them that show the painting itself and then how they look in a triangle, how they are fit into a triangle. Now, sometimes they go outside of the lines just a little bit, or they don't fill the entire space. But the general overall impression is that they are in a triangle. Why a triangle? Why an equilateral triangle, as a matter of fact? Well, a triangle is an image of stability, especially in the Renaissance. They wanted to give the idea of being stable. And so in all these paintings where the composition is in an equilateral triangle, the picture is very stable. Look at the poses that these people take in all these paintings. They are entirely able to hold that pose indefinitely. Now, that is a method of composition that was completely thrown out in the Baroque period, and in part also the artistic style that came after the Renaissance in Italy, which was called Mannerism, a style I never really cared for, to be honest with you, just on a personal level. But for the Renaissance, and this is the Renaissance, the Last Supper's in the Renaissance, the equilateral triangle gives an idea of stability. It's very difficult to tip a pyramid shape onto another side. The center of gravity is so low that tipping it onto another side it takes a great deal of force in relation to the size. In this painting, Jesus is in an equilateral triangle, and that suggests, since there are no other equilateral triangles, and since that equilateral triangle is around Jesus himself, that despite the chaos that's happening in this room at this moment, just after Jesus said, "One of you will betray me," and they're all freaking out, despite his sorrow and his fear, probably because of pending doom, temporary doom physically, but it's still the pain of death that's pending. Despite all that, Jesus is the only one who is stable in this entire painting. Now, we'll talk more about the triangle later, but that's amazing. This painting is a testimony to Da Vinci's absolute, unfathomable brilliance. We're talking the Mozart of art, or in my personal opinion, the Brahms of art. He would be the Shakespeare of pictorial art, and two-dimensional at that. He preferred two-dimensional art because you have two dimensions in a painting, but you give the impression of there being three. It's very magical, Da Vinci thought. This painting is one of his that just absolutely draws out his brilliance in a magnificent way. Every time I look at it, I find something new, and I am stunned by it every time. Okay. That is it for this episode. We'll talk more about this painting in an interpretive way the next episode. What are the meanings of things that are going on here? But also, more importantly, what is Da Vinci trying to teach us in this painting? What meaning are we trying to get? What lesson does he want us to take away? We'll talk about some possibilities on that. For now, I want to thank you all for watching. Please click like on the bottom of the video and subscribe if you're interested. If you haven't seen the first video that I put on this channel, it's an introduction to me. I'll put the link to that in the description. Go ahead and watch that, just if you want to learn more about me and why, as a literature teacher, I'm talking about pictorial art. Feel free to subscribe and click that bell icon so that you get notifications when the next episode of this and all other episodes are uploaded. Please leave a comment. If you have something to add, that would be great. If you have a positive, encouraging comment, I will accept that. If you have a question or something that you're not sure of, you don't agree with me, you can leave that in the comments as well. I do ask that you maintain a degree of respect, however. And then finally, also, please share this with other art enthusiasts or other Da Vinci admirers or whoever might just benefit in some other way. I ask that you please share it. Until next time, have an excellent couple of weeks. I have 4 channels altogether, so I just go one to the other, to the other, to the other. So I will do 3 other videos, one on each of my other channels before I get back to this. Be well, be strong, and understand what Christ has done for you. Without him, your eternity is hopeless. With him, you have more than hope. But Jesus is our hope.